New Super Mario Bros. Is one of the most interesting series of games in the Plumbers franchise, and that's mostly because of how uninteresting they are. Don't get me wrong, they're all perfectly good games with plenty of fun to be had in each, but nowadays, they're just seen as nothing more than generic Mario games. Well, that goes for all except one, and that is New Super Luigi U, released for the Wii U in 2013. This $20 DLC to New Super Mario Bros. U was created for the original year of Luigi, and at first glance, yes, it does just look like New Super Mario Bros. U, but now starring Luigi. But once you actually play the game, it becomes something much more unique. The overall presentation and world map may be the same, but the levels are now smaller, harder, and under a strict 100-second time limit. This was such a fresh new experience that I've always wanted to dive into at some point. So, now that I'm starting to dabble in challenge videos again, I wanted to try a pacifist run. Is it possible to beat New Super Luigi U without touching a single enemy? Here are the rules. I have to beat this game without killing or making contact with any enemies, with the only exceptions being boss battles. I'm also going to try to avoid using secret exits, but I'm allowed to use them if it means the challenge can continue. So without further ado, it's Ouija time! The game starts with Luigi and the Toads having some tea with Peach, but all of a sudden, Bowser flies in, grabs Luigi and the Toads, and launches them all the way to Acorn Plains, where our adventure begins. 1-1 was a pretty easy level. There are some flying squirrels that'll swoop by, but you'll always have plenty of time to react and avoid them. 1-2 takes place underground, and there's quite a few more enemies to avoid like piranha plants and Koopas, but as long as you're careful, you'll be fine. Next up is our first tower level, and there actually weren't that many enemies aside from this long string of dry bones near the end, but those are easy to avoid. Defeat Boom Boom the Mad Lad, and you'll be good to go. Before I moved on, I grabbed this super acorn on the map, which may be helpful later. 1-3 features rolling hills and where you'd normally get introduced to Yoshi, but blazing through this level is so easy I didn't even bother using him. 1-4 has some giant piranha plants, but I always had enough room to move over or under them, so no big deal. I also gave 1-5 a try, and this probably would have been difficult had I not have been provided a baby Yoshi to help me out, so that was nice. 1-Castle didn't have that many enemies for the first half, but then we got to this part, where there were some munchers spread across the platforms. Thankfully, there was a P-switch nearby to turn all those coins into blocks, so I was able to run over them and make it to Lemmy, who's just as easy to beat as usual. 2-1 is the first level of Layer Cake Desert and features tons of fishy boopkins throwing spike balls at you. Too bad that just running forward and occasionally jumping will be enough to avoid them. 2-2 requires a little more brain power, as not only do you have pokies on the ground and on the ceiling, but grolls rolling around as well, but it's still possible. 2-3 takes place in the dark and has lots of fire bros and fire-breathing piranha plants. Make sure to take your time and carefully avoid everything so you don't accidentally run into an enemy you couldn't see. As for 2-Tower, the only enemies you need to watch out for are these dry bones near the beginning, but then you'll be fine. And on my way to the next level, I was able to snag another super acorn without getting caught. 2-4 thankfully didn't have that many enemies aside from the occasional flying squirrel and piranha plant, but those were easy to avoid. 2-5 has those blue spikes that throw spike balls from above, but since most of them are above you, you don't have to worry about touching them as much. 2-6 wasn't bad for the most part, but just make sure to be careful near the end, as you've got piranha plants moving really fast and Lakitu throwing stuff from above. And then we've got 2-Castle, and the first part is pretty simple with some basic platforming, and then, oh my god, that's a lot of dry bones. Yeah, for some reason, the game decided to place a large horde of enemies in your way. Don't worry, you can avoid them with a well-timed jump, it just took me by surprise. Defeat Morton, and you've beaten World 2. As you move forward, the game needs you to pick between going to Frosted Glacier or Sparkling Waters. I decided to go with Frosted Glacier, and honestly, it was just so I wouldn't have to deal with water levels. 4-1 features those annoying bruisers that'll rapidly try to punch you. The biggest problem wasn't touching the enemies, but constantly getting hit by barrels that the goddamn bruisers punch towards me. But once you figure out how to avoid them, then it's all good. 4-2 features lots of penguins sliding around, around. And when I say lots, I mean it. There are so many penguins that you need to watch out for. There is enough space to avoid them, but it's important to keep an eye out with how fast they're moving. 4- Tower features those icicles that'll fall down when you get close to them, and you have to bait them into killing these bony beetles. And before you say anything, I technically didn't kill them, the icicles did, so back off. I then defeated Boom Boom and moved on with my day. 4-3 has a bunch of fire-breathing piranha plants and fire bros, but this is another case where just running forward and jumping will be enough to clear it. And as I moved on, I got another super acorn from this penguin. But then we get to 4-4, and all of a sudden, the difficulty increases dramatically. This level features those platforms that move up and down based on the weight on each side, but you also have flying squirrels and bonsai bills to deal with. The first half isn't too bad with some practice, but then the second half just gets absurdly hard. The flying squirrels will now walk on the platforms and fly in the air at the same time, and then of course, you've got the fucking bonsai bills shooting towards you too. I tried this level so many times, but I just couldn't make it without touching an enemy. I even equipped one of my squirrel suits to help me, but that didn't work either. And to make matters worse, I literally got a game over and had to redo the previous levels again. This is the kind of brutality this level brought. But then, after literally 15 minutes of failing, I realized that this level is actually on a split path, which means there's another level on the other side I can try instead. So I did, and this level was a million times easier. You just have to jump over some buzzy beetles and piranha plants and then it's fine, which honestly just makes me more angry that I wasted my time trying the other level for so long. After that is a ghost house, which did force me to make some precise jumps between these boos, but nothing too crazy. And finally, there's 4-Castle, which has lots of thwomps, but since you're meant to just speed through the level anyway, it isn't any different than a normal playthrough. Beat Wendy and destroy her ship, then boom, we're halfway through the game. This would be the point where I talk about the Sparkling Waters world, but after the shit I had to put up with in this world, I'm just gonna skip it. But of course, before we move on to World 5, Bowser Jr. is gonna stop by for a sec and give us an airship level. There's quite a few different enemies to be found here, but I always had enough space to move around, and the first fight with Bowser Jr. was as easy as always. 5-1 requires you to swing off a bunch of vines to get to the end. The only tricky moments were this part where I had to spin over some Koopas and when I had to run across these pipes, but other than that, this level was fine. 5-2 has a bunch of blocks that rise and fall out of the poison swamp, so you have to be careful to time your jumps so not to accidentally fall in. However, there weren't that many enemies aside from some Koopas, so you're mostly just playing the level normally. In fact, you can just do what I did and glide through the level to make things easier on yourself. 5-Tower contains more of those rolling grolls we saw earlier, but they're pretty easy to avoid. Now brace yourself, but in this fight, Boom Boom grows extra big. Wow, look at him! And I still beat him in 10 seconds, so yeah. We have another ghost house stage, and this one was definitely a lot harder than the last one. There's a ton more boos circling around, and you especially have to be cautious in this part, as boos will fly randomly, and the lights can make it hard to see them coming. But if you're careful, you'll eventually beat it. 5-4 takes place in this beautiful painting-inspired level, where you have to jump on moving pipes that spin all over the place. Keep an eye out for the piranha plants that pop out of some of them, and you'll be good. Be careful to avoid the boos in this little area, and you'll soon reach 5-6. This level has tons of moving bridges, with Sumo Bros sending lightning down from above. Thankfully, since these guys are all up there, all you have to do is avoid their lightning, and you'll make it to the end. And finally, there's 5-Castle, where you need to swing off chains and avoid the waves of lava coming from the right. Once again, there's a few dry bones, but you'll always have enough space to jump around them. Defeat Iggy, and you can make your way to World 6. 6-1 has lots of fuzzies riding on rails. The main thing to keep in mind is that you need to be patient when going through the level so you don't accidentally run into one of them, but other than that, it's not so bad. 6-2 is an underground stage where you have to avoid this Porcupuffer swimming down below. Thankfully, there's a bunch of space to jump above it, and honestly, I'd be more worried about these crabs throwing rocks as they can be a little more unpredictable. Up next is 6-Tower, where you have even more grolls rolling crawling around. These guys are a lot harder to avoid than you may think, since not only are there more of them, but there's a lot less space to maneuver. But if you take your time and plan things out, it'll work out by the end. 6-3 brings back more of those fishy boopkins throwing spike balls at you. However, since they're standing in one spot, you don't really have to worry about them as much, as you have to simply jump over their spike balls. 6-5 has those piranha plants that can stretch up in the air to try and eat you. The only truly difficult part was this section, where you have moving platforms, tall piranha plants, and a big fire piranha plant all at the same time. It took me a few tries, but it is possible. But then, we get to what is easily the hardest, most infuriating part of this challenge so far, and that is the second tower level. What you're supposed to do is use these platforms to spin your way to the top while avoiding all the fireballs and sumo bros. Sounds simple enough, right? Yeah, one problem though, there is so much everywhere. The sumo bros are incredibly annoying, as when they shoot their lightning is completely random, and then you've got these dumbass dry bones that walk on the platforms you're supposed to use to get to the top, but then when you're trying to avoid them, you've also got the fire bars that can still hit you. And keep in mind, unlike the snow level from before, there's no way for me to skip this level. I have to beat it to move on. I tried and failed so many times I lost count. I did eventually come up with some strategies, like how I didn't actually need to use the splitting platforms for some areas, but even still, I was having no luck. And, just like the snow level, I ended up getting a game over again! I was genuinely beginning to believe that this level was impossible without touching an enemy, but then, on my first attempt after the game over, this happened. I was able to use the first two screws just fine, then I jumped on the two blocks to avoid the dry bones. I got hit by some lightning and some fire, but I didn't touch any enemies. Then, I wall jumped on the edge to avoid more enemies, and finally, I barely snagged the edges of these platforms before making it to the top. And the boss fight was as easy as always. Holy freaking shit, that was so freaking hard. But luckily for me, 6-7 wasn't that much of a hassle, and neither was 6-castle. Sure, there were a few precise jumps I needed to make, but nothing too crazy. On to 7-1. Normally, you're supposed to freeze the fuzzies and use them as platforms to beat the stage, but since we can't touch them, that won't be an option. You can make the first jump with enough speed, but after that, yeah, there's no way we're getting through this. Unless we use a super acorn. That's right, by running really fast, jumping, gliding, and then boosting upward, you can just reach the other side without touching anything, and this strategy works for the rest of the level too. Just be sure to also watch out for the ice bros. 7-2 features lots of chain chomps and wigglers. Again, you're normally supposed to jump on the enemies to get around, but since we can't do that, we'll have to glide over them again. I was a bit worried about 7-Tower considering how abysmal the last one was, but thankfully, this one wasn't nearly as bad. There is this one stupid-ass fire bro in the way that you need to make a very scary jump to avoid him, and then you have to show off your epic jumping skills to not get burned to a crisp, but eventually, you'll reach Kamek and beat the stage. Next, we have another ghost house, and this one has those fake item boxes that'll float around and try to hit you. But these things are very easy to avoid and won't stop you from beating the stage. We then have this little puzzle where we need to pick the right path, and I managed to pick the right one on my first try and end up in 7-4. This level has lots of clouds that'll bounce you high in the air when you jump on them. This will actually be incredibly helpful, as now you'll have plenty of height to avoid the enemies without much trouble. We then move on to 7-6, where we have to ride these snake blocks all the way to the end. Do these little cloud guys even count as enemies? Well, I'll avoid them just in case. I'd say the only tricky part is when I had to avoid these goombrats on the floating platforms, but even then, it wasn't so bad. And then, we have 7-Castle, and the most annoying part wasn't even the enemies, but these giant blocks that move across the screen. Once you do get past them, you'll have a fight with Ludwig, and with him out of the way, we only have one world left. But before we get there, we need to get rid of the airship once and for all. The first section has you floating on this cloud while avoiding the giant claw trying to crush you. You have to be careful of the bob-ombs falling from the sky, but as long as you're paying attention, it's not that hard. The second half takes place on the airship itself with more bob-ombs, and finally, you have another fight with Junior. However, unlike before, the little brat will now throw bob-ombs onto the stage, so you need to watch out for them as well. But once you do take Junior down, you'll finally send the airship crashing into the ground, allowing you to enter the 8th and final world. Let's finish this thing. 8-1 has a bunch of fireballs raining from the sky, but surprisingly, there were barely any enemies aside from a few Koopas walking around. Which, hey, I'm not complaining. 8-2 requires you to ride this boat that'll carry you across the river of lava. However, enemies will constantly fall from the top, and if there's too many on the boat, it'll stop completely. So, without being able to kill any of the enemies, it won't be long before we can't progress any further. Is this the end of the quest? Well, not quite, as I managed to go back to the other worlds and collect a few super acorns, as well as stock up on some lives. So, with the super acorn equipped, I got the boat as far as I could without touching any enemies, then I jumped and glided over to these blocks over here, then beat the rest of the level without much trouble. 8-3 features lots of spinning gears and lava balls hopping from below, but since I still had my super acorn equipped, it actually wasn't that bad. 8-4 needs you to jump on this platform and tilt the Wii Remote or gamepad to move it. Make sure to be careful to avoid the electric Bowsers, and especially the falling bob-ombs, and with a bit of luck, you'll make it to the end. And now, for the moment you've all been waiting for. It's time for the final battle against Bowser. The first section with Bowser Jr. was really easy, as there were no enemies aside from those lava monsters that you would have to avoid anyway. Defeat Bowser, and just like that, we did it. We finally beat the Oh wait, there's a second phase? That's right. Bowser has grown very big, and the only way to beat him now is to wait for Junior to try to ground pound you, then you steal his ride and use it to smash Bowser in the head. Keep an eye on Bowser Jr. as he'll throw bob-ombs onto the stage for you to avoid, but they're not that much of a threat. And with that, we defeated Bowser and saved the princess, confirming that, yes, it is possible to beat New Super Luigi U without touching a single enemy. I honestly can't believe I managed to pull this off. This was definitely a lot harder to do than with the original Super Mario Bros., but alas, I beat it with only a few stinkers here and there. So, with this challenge conquered, I'm gonna go take a break, as I need to recover from all this madness. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, then make sure to give it a like and subscribe so you can see more videos like this. Have a great day, stay safe out there, and I will see you in the next one.